Hi folks, welcome to this video on anxiety. Now, this is linked to arousal. If you've watched the arousal video, theories of arousal, you'll know that if we become over aroused, if our arousal level gets too high, there is, that's often caused by an increase in anxiety or associated with an increase in anxiety. Cognitive anxiety is mental anxiety, somatic is physiological anxiety. But what we're going to look at is everything to do with anxiety now. So anxiety is caused by high arousal levels. So when we become over aroused, we become anxious. And it's often the result of stress in sport and fears over failure, playing in front of a large crowd, overemphasis on winning. So when these pressures build and these expectations build, we can increase our anxiety levels because we become over aroused. And what we're going to specifically look at here is things to do with competitive anxiety, because obviously we're interested in athletes, we're interested in performers, what happens when they start to get anxious. So competitive anxiety, that is, as you'd expect, anxiety experienced during competitive situations. So nothing too complicated there. But there are four things within that. So number one, individual differences in the situation. So in other words, for example, you'll often see greater anxiety, higher arousal in derby games. Two teams from the same city or the same area playing against each other. You will see in friendly games. You'll see greater anxiety in top of the table deciders or cup matches than you will in mid-table. Both teams don't need, not going to get relegated, not going to get promoted. You're not going to see as much anxiety in those situations. So the differences in the situation can affect the level of competitive anxiety. But here's a couple of ones. Trait and state anxiety. So we've had this already. We've got 4 or 5 types of anxiety. We've got cognitive and somatic, as I mentioned earlier. Cognitive is psychological anxiety, fear, worry, nervousness. Somatic is physiological anxiety, sweating, muscle tension, trembling, things like that. We've also got traits and state. Now, if you watch the video on personalities, think what traits were. Traits are your technical term for characteristics, which are genetic, which are inherited. So in other words, we have a genetic anxiety level. So trait anxiety is natural or innate or genetic anxiety. Now, you were either born with naturally high anxiety levels, naturally low anxiety levels, or anywhere in between. You know that better than anyone else. Are you someone who always gets anxious or always chilled out, or is it somewhere in between that? State anxiety refers to the situation. So state anxiety is brought on by the situation. So, for example, if you are sat in a classroom, you might have low state anxiety. If I tell you were doing a test in 5 minutes, your state anxiety might increase because I've suddenly changed the situation. Now there's more pressure. Now there's more expectation. What we find though is those with high trait anxiety, so if you are naturally genetically highly anxious, we call you A trait, right? If you are A trait, you are more likely to experience high state anxiety. What we mean by that is if you have naturally high levels of anxiety, it doesn't matter where I put you, in an exam, in the changing rooms before a cup match, or on a beach in a hammock in the Caribbean. You are going to find something to worry about. You are going to be anxious. So regardless of the situation, regardless of the state, you are always going to be anxious if you have high trait anxiety. So thirdly then, we've got competitive trait anxiety. So trait anxiety is mentioned here, as it is there. The trait anxiety, as we said, natural genetic levels of anxiety. What this is, maybe just every time we put you in a competitive situation, you always get anxious, i.e. you have got a natural genetic component to be anxious when you're in a competitive situation. So even those who are A trait are not anxious in all sports situations. And the classic one here is you might know someone, this might be you, but when it's training, they are a world beater. They're absolutely brilliant. When they're training midweek with you in your team, they're absolutely class. But on a Saturday or a Sunday, they seem to go to pieces. And it's when there's no competition there, they demonstrate low anxiety levels. As soon as you put them in a competitive situation, you have high anxiety levels. So making sure you can, define each of these types of anxiety, that's the key thing here. And there's also the competition process, which is a combination of your personality type, the competitive trait anxiety, and the situation. So these 4 things all affect the level of anxiety you will display or maybe not display in a competitive situation. So what are your anxiety levels? Well, there's a way of measuring them, and we call it the Sport Competition Anxiety Test, or SCAT form. And there's a copy of one here that you can download off the internet, very easy to do. So it's a self-report questionnaire. You fill this in yourself. You don't have to have a psychologist with you. But it is competition specific, because if you read all these questions, they're all related to competition. Competing against others is socially enjoyable, rarely, sometimes, or often. You tick which one applies to you. Before I compete, I feel uneasy, rarely, sometimes, often. You go through these 15 questions and you tick. And on the back of this form, although you can't see it, is a way to grade each answer, and you get a SCAT score. And if you score less than 17, you have a low level of anxiety. 17 is 24, you have an average level of anxiety. More than 24, you have a high level of anxiety. So we can use this SCAT questionnaire to predict levels of state anxiety. And this questionnaire and variations of it has been shown to be highly reliable in predicting future anxiety levels. So we can build up an idea of this about you and then see, are you the kind of person who will get anxious in a competitive situation? So this questionnaire as well has shown that cognitive and state anxiety increase as competition approaches. So in other words, the state anxiety, the situation's changing, you are getting close to the competition. So that's going to increase your anxiety. But also cognitive anxiety, your psychological anxiety, worry, fear, nervousness, that also increases as the competition approaches. How do they know this? Well, what they do is they get athletes to fill this in maybe 3 or 4 hours before competition, then an hour before competition, and see what's changed. And by doing that, psychologists have also found that somatic anxiety can also increase in the build-up to competition. You start to tremble, you start to sweat, the muscle tension starts to increase. So, nothing that we wouldn't expect, but it's making sure that we can identify those athletes where it's getting too high, and those athletes where actually that's, yes, your cognitive and somatic has increased, but not to a dangerously high level where it's going to have a negative impact on your performance. However, if you have watched the video on theories of arousal, you might remember that if both cognitive and somatic anxiety increase significantly, either in the build to or during competition, that's what leads to catastrophe theory, that sudden drop in performance where you become over aroused very quickly. And remember, it's like inverted U where it goes up. If I bring my little pen on here, remember, if I just draw in this blank space here, catastrophe theory is when your anxiety does that to your performance. There is a sudden drop in it. So we need to make sure that we avoid that at all costs. And this questionnaire can help us identify who is potentially going to find themselves in that situation. Right, so just a quick recap on somatic and cognitive anxiety, but also this could come up in the exam. Somatic anxiety, definition, physiological anxiety. Remember, like I said in a previous video, think back to when you did somatotypes at school, ectomorph, endomorph, mesomorph. Somatotypes are to do with body shape, your actual physiology or anatomy and physiology. So somatic, as in somatotype, physiological anxiety, trembling, sweating, muscle tension. Cognitive, I remember it this way, the cogs turning in your brain. So cognitive is psychological or mental anxiety to do with the brain. Fear, worry, things like that. Now, in order to get into your zone, I know we've mentioned catastrophe theory, but if you think back to peak flow theory as well, in order to get into your zone of optimum functioning, they say you've got to be in these situations. You've got to find yourself relaxed, confident, focused, effortless, automatic. You've got to have fun. You've got to feel yourself in control. Automatic, what I mean by there is your movements are automatic. You don't have to think about them. You just do them subconsciously. Could they ask you about these? What it needs to be like, what you need to be like to get into the zone? Yeah, they could. And that's a long list of words. I've tried forever and ever and ever to try and think of an acronym, somewhere breaking it down. The only thing I could think of was my favourite football team in the world, which is Farce FC. Plenty of clubs I've played for could have been called Farce FC. It was a farce that we were allowed to play because we were terrible. But the reality is, Farce FC, what could it stand for? It can stand for fun. It can stand for automatic. It can stand for relaxed. It can stand for confident. It can stand for effortless. It can stand for, what's the F, focus, and it could stand for being in control. So you might want to remember that. I don't think you're going to get a mark talking about all of these 7 for a 7-mark question, but you might get asked about how would a person feel, in terms of when they're in the zone, in terms of their cognitive and somatic anxiety. Well, they won't feel these to a very high level. They'll feel these instead. They'll feel relaxed, confident, focused. They'll feel like it's effortless. They'll feel like their movements are automatic. They'll feel like they're having fun, and they will feel in control of the situation. Now, when you start to get over aroused, or you think your cognitive and somatic anxiety is too high, or you're starting to suffer with competitive anxiety, or you are high H rate, you are naturally an anxious person. There are various strategies, but there's one that they give particular emphasis on the exam board, and that is cue utilization. Using or utilizing a cue in order to calm you down. So what you do is, what we're basically saying there is, you keep focus and you block out distractions and you only concentrate on the important cues. So, don't think about the crowd. That's irrelevant what the crowd are doing. They can't influence your performance. Think about your opposition. Think about the movement of your teammates. Think about the space in front of you. Think about the gun that you're reacting to or the beep that you're reacting to during the start or whatever it is. Utilize the cues that are important to you in your environment. And that's very easy to say and quite difficult to do. But the effective use of cues by coaches can enhance concentration and keep you in your zone of optimum functioning. Now, just remember, from previous videos, that is your zone of optimum functioning. You want to find yourself in there. Your arousal levels want to be around about here, so you find your performance levels are at their optimum, at their peak. That's what we're trying to do. So what can the coach do? It's things like, actually making them train in front of distractions. Having lots of people making noise whilst they're training, so they'll learn to block that out. Or maybe putting certain players in a training environment in certain coloured bibs, focus on their movement. Put them in a bright coloured bib, bright coloured cones and posts and things like that when you're training to highlight certain movements and certain angles and certain passes you want them to make. So make sure they focus on the relevant cues and make sure they block out the irrelevant cues. That will help them focus. That will help keep them in their zone. That will help keep their arousal levels more manageable. Okay, that's everything to do with anxiety. Hope you found this video useful, folks.